My name is Jim Turk, and I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression. I would like to begin by acknowledging the land on which I am speaking to you today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. On behalf of the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson University, I want to welcome you along with our this event's co-sponsors, which include the Canadian Urban Libraries Council, PEN Canada, the Edmonton Public Library, the Thunder Bay Public Library, the Toronto Public Library, and the Vancouver Public Library. This is the fourth in the Center for Free Expression's In Conversation series, featuring prominent guests discussing issues of importance in the current political moment in which democracy is under threat, public discourse on vital matters is fragmented into self-affirming ideological bubbles, and when not discouraged altogether. And censorship is increasingly seen as an ally rather than an impediment to social justice. Our conversation today is with Adolph Reed, Jr. Adolph is a prominent public intellectual and a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Pennsylvania. He has written and edited a number of important books on race, class, and inequality, and he writes regularly on these issues for the New Republic, as well as for other progressive publications. It's a pleasure and honor to have you with us today. Adolph, welcome.
Oh, hi, Jim. Thanks very much for having me, and I'm really looking forward to it. It's a great program, great event, and I'm honored to be part of it. So thank you again.
Well, thank you. The title for today's discussion is Anti-Black Racism and Inequality, What is to be Done? We are delighted that Adolph will be in conversation with Umair Muhammad, a Ph.D. candidate in political science at York University and author of Confronting Injustice, Social Activism in the Age of Individualism. Umair also produces and co-hosts a very interesting podcast called Oats for Breakfast. He is also a parent of a new baby who just turned 2 months today. Welcome, Umair. We're glad you can be with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
In terms of today's program, after about 45 to 50 minutes of conversation with Adolph, Umair will turn to the audience, to you, to bring you into the discussion. As you listen to their conversation, if you have a question at any point that you would like addressed when we turn to the audience, please click the Q&A tab at the bottom center of your screen. If you look down at the bottom center of your screen, you'll see Q&A. Just click on that and you can write down your question, and please do it as you think of it rather than waiting till we come to that portion so that they'll be all there. In any case, now it's time to turn to our guests.
All right, thanks, Jim. And just to start off with, thanks to the CFE and of course to Jim and Ange and to the other people who were involved in organizing this and for deciding to include me. That's very nice of you. And thanks also Adolph for being here to chat. So let's just jump right in here. I was thinking that the place to start maybe would be to say that when we often talk about the relationship between racism and inequality, we allow descriptions to get in the way of explanations or to stand in for explanations. So any number of statistics, for instance, could be pointed to describe the fact that racial minorities tend to bear a disproportionate amount of harm and suffering in society. So for instance, Michelle Alexander's famous 2010 book, The New Jim Crow, highlights the issue of the disproportionate incarceration of Black men and women in the United States. In recent months, we've heard a great deal about the disproportionate killing of Black men by American police officers. One could find similar kinds of data across a plethora of issues, income inequality, health outcomes, and so on. But Adolph, you make the case that descriptions based on aggregate data often hide as much as they reveal. And not only that, but you also maintain that descriptions are not explanations. Just because one can describe a situation in terms of racial inequality doesn't mean that the explanation for the inequality has to do with race and racism. Could you tell us why you think that?
Sure, that's a good question. I think it's a good place to start. Well, I mean, let me start by pointing out what I think is the structure of a rhetorical narrative that makes the argument from disparity to to racism as a stand-in for an explanation actually work, right? And I think, for instance, that the Michelle Alexander book is a very good instance of the narrative structure that. Because in reading that book, like, she repeats the trope throughout that mass incarceration is like the new Jim Crow. It's like the new Jim Crow. It's like the new Jim Crow, until all of a sudden it isn't. And even she acknowledges that, well, it's not really that hot a metaphor, right? Or an analogy, which begs the question, well, what's the work that the historical analogy does? And not just in Alexander's work, but in many other instances of efforts to explain, I'll just leave it with that. Efforts to explain the causal dynamics that undergird contemporary inequalities. One turns to analogy with the past, right? To say that this form of inequality it makes us think of Jim Crow. This form of inequality makes us think of slavery, and another kind of emphatic expression of it is the contention that some particular outrage or some pattern of outrages makes it seem as though nothing has changed since 1860 or sooner. And the problem is that what's inadequate? Rather, the work that narrative structure does is kind of a sleight of hand that enables proffering racism or white supremacy as a cause or as a causal explanation. And the way that works is that you say, see, like, this same kind of disparity existed 150 years ago. It existed 70 years ago. It exists now. And we know there was a white supremacist order 150 years ago. We know there's a white supremacist order 70 years ago. So, I mean, therefore, white supremacy or racism has to be the explanation of the inequality in the present. The problem is that's not a causal account, right? It's an alternative to a causal account. Like, it doesn't tell us how racism, I mean, supposedly produces mass incarceration or produces whatever the particular disparity is at the moment. And to that extent, it doesn't really help us if that kind of contention by analogy to the past, I wouldn't even call it like historical analogy, but analogy with the past doesn't help us or doesn't shed light on how, in particular, inequalities in the present are produced, then it doesn't help us address how to confront them, how to overcome them, how to challenge them, and therefore I think it's misplaced at best.
All right. So how this is a big question, but that I think we'll be talking about the entire time here. But what would you say is responsible for it, or how would you explain the inequalities that persist in the present, if not by going back to slavery or to Jim Crow or whatever else?
Right. Well, I mean, it depends on the character of the inequalities, but I tend to look first toward toward the political economy, right? So I mean, take for instance, I mean, let's shift from mass incarceration to patterns of police killing, right? Which like seems to be the sweet spot for people who want to argue that the existence of these disparities prove the causal force of an abstraction called white supremacy. Because it's true that in the United States, police kill Black people at roughly twice their rate in the overall population. So if you stop with finding the disparity, then you say, okay, well, it's outrageous that Black people are killed at more than twice their incidence or their incidence in the population. I mean, therefore, the racism has to be the response. Well, but in most years, at least an equal number of whites as Blacks are killed, and whites most often make up a greater number of the total of people who are killed by police than Blacks. So a question then is, well, if police terrorism is directed only toward Blacks and other peoples of color, then how are we to understand all these white people who get killed by police? Because even though the total percentages of whites who are killed, or the total percentages of whites among the N of people who are killed by the police tends to be considerably lower than the representation in the overall population, they are still a majority of the people who are killed by the police. Well, and Michelle Alexander faces the same problem with respect to mass incarceration, right? The fact that there are more whites in jail overall than Blacks, and the only response that you're left with in the disparitarian framework is that they're collateral damage, which on its face doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you look at police patterns of police killing by a different, or according to a different metric than just race, and look at the zip codes, right? Features of the zip codes of people who are killed by police, what you'll see is that people who are killed by police are disproportionately people from very poor zip codes. Now, as my friend and colleague Walter Ben Michaels and I argued about a month or so ago in a piece called "The Trouble with Disparity," is that there's nothing especially shocking about saying that police disproportionately kill poor people, because in a capitalist society, one of the functions of police is to protect property and property people from poor people, and especially under neoliberalism, to suppress the poor. So I think, and when we began to unpack the other, disparities, COVID-19 is a great example, right? I mean, from the very beginning in the US, discourse about COVID-19 went directly, and this was across the ideological spectrum, that Blacks were especially vulnerable. And so you ask, well, so what makes Blacks especially vulnerable to COVID-19? And again, I've written about this because that problem, or that narrative, raises the real danger of a return of race medicine, right? Because it smuggles in a premise that there's something, either biologically or culturally, and for most people, most of the time, there's really no substantive difference between biology and culture, right? They signify each other. And that can lead just as easily to an argument that Blacks are somehow responsible through their habits or their inferior physiognomy or physiology rather, to being victimized by the worst effects of COVID-19, which I'm as convinced as one can be without firm evidence, which I guess should only be so much, but that one of the reasons that that the Trumpsters were so comfortable in picking up on targeting COVID-19 protections as being un-American was the sense that, well, like only the weak and the vulnerable get it, and we aren't part of the weak and the vulnerable, so to hell with it, right? I know I kind of rambled through that, but let me punctuate it with the one observation that I hope will bring the rambling home, which is that from the mid-30s through the 60s, really, Black activists and racial advocates and civic elites rarely, if ever, campaigned against an abstraction called racism. They campaigned for specific policies and practices and against the specific policies and practices. But almost never did we see attempts to mobilize against an abstraction called racism or white supremacy. And I think that there are reasons for that we can maybe unpack or unfold as the discussion goes on. But I think it points to a problem of mobilization, right? That if our struggle is supposed to be fundamentally a struggle against an abstraction called white supremacy, or its son, the Holy Ghost, right? The abstraction called racism. How do we know when we've identified the enemy? I mean, how do we know to lock in on it? And how can we know when we've possibly won? And to that extent, that's one of the reasons that I've compared a political struggle against racism to being kind of an equivalent of anti-terrorism campaigns, right? Because by definition, you can't win those because it's an idea, right? It's an abstraction, and it's to some extent each, right? To some extent, is in the eyes of the beholder. Right. I mean, if you're Palestinian, like, you tend to see strikes coming from the Israeli Air Force as a terrorism. If you're an Israeli, you tend to see the desperation of a supermarket bomb, right, as an act of terrorism. So let me stop there because I feel like I'm kind of running away from the question anyway.
No, I think there was a lot of good stuff there. And, on the issue of disproportionate police killings, one of the things I've thought about this is that a way to solve this problem would be for the police to kill more white people.
Right. Right. That's actually a question that we put in our piece, right? Well, okay, so, right, because you can level up, you can level down.
Yeah.
Right.
So if that's the main concern, then that can certainly be solved in that way.
Well, that comes to this point too, though. Well, sorry, but I think this may help. Like, my friend and colleague Preston Smith, who's also a political scientist, has made what I think is a pretty powerful argument over close to a couple of decades now about the need to recognize two distinct nodes or norms of justice that have coexisted within Black American politics and like political thought and activity since the mid-1930s. One he describes as a norm of racial democracy, which is, quite simply radical equality of opportunity. And the norm there is that Black people should be roughly, or should be represented roughly in their proportion in the overall population in every notch in the distribution of good things and bad things within the society. So like 3% or 13 or 12% of the billionaires, 12% of the unemployed, and 12% of everything in between. And there were actually people who have made this argument quite explicitly in the past, and And I think the only reason we don't see people making it now is that they feel they don't have to, because it's internalized, right? At the core of an anti-racist understanding. The other norm that Smith points to is the norm that's familiar to a lot of us, the social democratic norm, which is primarily focused on closing the gap between the top and the bottom across the society, right? Without regard to ascriptive categories, right? And one nice way, I think, or a simple way to think of the distinctions between those two norms is that the former, right, the norm of racial democracy is focused exclusively on inequalities produced within capitalism, whereas the norm of social democracy is focused on addressing inequalities produced by capitalism, right? And look, I mean, I don't think anybody would argue against, the principle that differences in ascriptive status should impede or should not impede the individual's mobility, right? So, if we're going to have a world in which there are billionaires and paupers, then if we accept such a world as the only possible universe, then okay, then a world like that in which people are not kept out of the realm of the billionaires because they're Black, or aren't forced into the realm of paupery because they're Black, is better than the one in which they are forced or kept out of the top and forced into the bottom. But is that really a gratifying ideal of social justice? And you can add in the experience of the last closing in on half century now, when inequalities as a period in which inequalities within capitalism are becoming sharper and sharper, greater and greater, right? It feels like a less and less, or the racial democratic norm feels like a less and less desirable goal for us, right? Because no matter what, as capitalist society becomes increasingly on equals, a larger percentages of Black people, like that's what you're interested in only, are going to wind up at the bottom, while there's some small increase in percentages of black people at the top. So anyway, sorry, now I'll stop.
No, are you able to actually hear me? It's something about my internet says, oh, no, it's fine now. I think my internet's back, right?
Yeah, oh yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So no, I think there was a lot of good stuff there. And I think the other thing to note, as you've been pointing out in your recent writings, is that it's not the case, if it was at one time, that Black people are kept out of the top echelons of society. In fact, nearly 15% of Black families in the U.S. have an income of $100,000 or more. That's a few million people. Whereas in 50 or 60 years ago, that you couldn't have said that.
Right.
But let's talk about abstractions for a second, because you mentioned the abstraction of white supremacy and racism. But it might actually be helpful to pull back a little bit and briefly touch on the abstraction of race.
Mm-hmm.
As I think in the popular imagination, race is accepted as a kind of primordial feature of human existence, and it just seems to be a kind of natural consequence of the phenotypic characteristics that exist among human beings, whether those characteristics have to do with skin color, as in the case of white people or Black people, or whether it has to do with the shape of people's eyes, which is supposed to be a defining feature of the so-called East Asian race. Um, and I think, and not only do we see these differences as resulting in in creating the categories of race. Um, that's the popular imagination, right? And I think in a way, it's it's not as harmful as the activist imagination, which says that not only are there races, but they have distinct interests. Whereas I don't think that popularly people would, even if they imagine that races exist, would necessarily think that.
Mhm.
So what would you say by contrast is your understanding of race?
Well, okay, and that's a great question, I think, and I'll try to be clear, and we'll see if that works. Um, so, I mean, here's the way that I go at it, right? All class societies, right, of whatever sort, right, depend to varying degrees on narratives of essential difference, by which I mean on or the legitimacy of any existing hierarchy depends on a narrative that people are where they belong, right? It doesn't have to be a meritocratic one, which is a relatively novel um, form of of ascriptive hierarchy that can be reified as test scores, maybe. Um, but 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 discourses of naturalized difference that justify at the common sense level that people who are assigned to different population categories, because it's important to recall, maybe I should say this from the outset, that all of the evidence has shown that our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, is a pretty narrow little group that's descended from a pretty small little bottleneck, and that there are no biological bases for projecting or for proclaiming that there are any, discernible human, different or discernibly different human populations between the level of the species as a whole and the level of the immediate breeding group, right? Like some county in South India, right? So, but as we know, that narratives of ascriptive difference, that is, that define people by what they supposedly are rather than what they do, um, can be causally significant and can create common sense, understanding whether or not they're ultimately true. People just have to believe that they are. One of the classic illustrations of this is in American immigration studies and labor. Word got out for some reason that Italians were good stonemasons, and then employers began to hire Italians and make them stonemasons. And the biggest centers of like steel production in the U.S. have been in Chicago, Northwest Indiana, Buffalo, Baltimore, and each one of those cities has a substantial Polish population. Well, why? Because there's an understanding that Poles are good steel workers. And it's not that there's a Polish gene for smelting or for steel production. It's that an abstract narrative that constructs populations in an idealist way has been deployed in such a way as to make something that looks like a self-fulfilling prophecy. But that's a digression. Let me get back to the main point here. So if the work that narratives of that naturalized difference do is to legitimize existing hierarchies by communicating that everyone within the society is where they should be, then what we can see, like race as a subset that genus of narratives of ascriptive difference. So race, from that perspective, emerges and race as a particular kind of category, which we can talk about to and follow up maybe. But it emerges at a particular historical moment in the context of the phenomena like chattel slavery in the New World, European expansion in the New as well as the Old World, as narratives that justify a level of inequality, right? In the U.S., I think a particularly telling instance is that, from the founding or before the founding through, more or less around 1830s, the main defense of slavery among governing elites was that it was a necessary evil, right? And these guys like Thomas Jefferson and even Alexander Hamilton and like others would say, well, yeah, I mean, it's this whole thing about owning people isn't really cool, but that's how that's what I have to do to get paid, and I have to get paid, right? Right, and that also says something about what the center of gravity of political discourse was during that period, because everyone who was a legitimate participant in these political debates was a white man who owned large property, both real cattle or chattel, family, children, livestock, indentured servants and whatnot. It's only when, with the coming of universal suffrage, when the governing elites had to presume that they were part of a conversation that involved people who were outside their own class, that we see a shift in defense of slavery from the necessary evil to the positive good. And that's when you get the ideological crap about how, well, it's good for the slave because slaves are suited to slavery by virtue of who they are, and it's good for us, and so forth and so on. From that perspective, right, race has a specific history, and it's not that old a history. And I mean, I read an article a couple of weeks ago about the recurring debate about whether Cleopatra had been black, and I mean, the classicists is quite good about this, and also, while being empathetic, right, made clear that, well, the problem with this argument or question is that it's anachronistic, because black didn't exist as a category, race didn't exist as a category, Egypt didn't exist as a category, right? So, and it's a natural human frailty, right, to read common sense knowledge back across the hands and sands of time, right, as though the categories that we take for granted now always existed, right? But so my argument is that race is a category of ascriptive hierarchy that emerged not out of necessity, but that emerged coincident with, or in colloquy maybe, with the emergence and growth of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery as an institution in the New World, as well as European expansion, beyond its own borders in the 19th century. Moreover, just to toss this little firecracker out there, the way that we think about race now, right, the 3 to 5 basic food groups or whatever, right, and the narratives around phenotype and whatnot, themselves didn't really start to harden and take shape until the second half of the 19th century. So from that perspective, from that perspective, I think it makes sense to think of white supremacy as, yes, of course, an ideology that people like Kipling and others pushed, but as an institutional practice, I prefer to see it or to see that construct fastened a little more tightly onto, the social, political, and an economic regime that emerged in the U.S. South after the defeat of Reconstruction and the populist insurgency at the end of the 19th century, because that's when actually for the first time racial regulation took on the sort of fundamental character that we all understand it to have had, and a lot of people like to think for whatever reasons that it still has. So is that responsive enough, Umair?
No, I think that's great. And I guess to follow up, we have a sense of why the right likes narratives that have to do with naturalized difference, whether that's gender or race or anything else. But why is this kind of narrative becoming increasingly common on the left?
That's an excellent question, and it's one that I've sort of tossed and turned and go back and forth to the lip of the abyss of despair 2 or 3 times a day in trying to grapple with. But to be honest, I mean, I think, well, I mean, I know that I tend, to start these responses by, as my grandmother would put it, going all around the Robin Hood's barn. But I think that one of the things that's happened is that, and again, like I'm focused on the U.S., but race and race ideology, both as racism and especially as anti-racism as a politics, is pretty much a pure American export now, right? I mean, but so through the, I think it's important to start the meter of history running at the end of World War II, right? We had, in the US in particular, but it's true like all over, I mean, the Western world and elsewhere, a moment here where, the question of which way forward after, the defeat of fascism was the world going to go. In the US, there was, a multiracial left, pardon me, and, in which most Black civic elites and actors, even those who were considered conservative at their time, presumed and said explicitly that essential conditions for continued Black advancement in post-war America, pardon me, were expansion of social wage policy at the national level, and expansion of CIO, or Congress of Industrial Organization style industrial trade unionism, because there was a general understanding, even among conservatives, that racial inequality and structural economic inequality were linked, and were linked in ways that maybe it might have been helpful to try to pick apart a little bit more, but the past is past. Pase lo que pase, right? But or better, like lo pasado pasó, right? But what happens then over the 50s and the 60s and in a more accelerated way beyond the 60s, it's like a sort of quiet or tacit frame for, or rather, a kind of tension in the substantive struggle over what post-war liberalism are going to be like. The tacit class struggle within that struggle was kind of played out over the extent to which federal economic policy was going to be centered on pursuing full employment versus the extent to which pursuit of currency currency stability was going to drive federal economic policy. That debate was resolved, ironically, partly around the civil rights. Connected to that debate was a struggle over what racial justice was going to mean, right? And through, well, as I said, I mean, through the 40s, a consensus among even centrist Black political organizations and actors was that the social democratic struggle and the struggle for racial justice were connected. Well, what happens over the course of the 50s is that the struggle for social democracy gets increasingly sidelined. First, by as a result of the direct counterattack on the New Deal and those forces that wanted to extend and expand it, that came from the capitalist class at the end of World War II. And this like I've always hated American exceptionalism, but one of the dumbest manifestations of it is this notion that there's something that we need to explain about why we don't have social wage protections here that everybody else in the civilized world has. And I think people talk about American cultural exceptionalism and individualism and whatever. I mean, racism, right? When the simplest explanation is that at the end of World War II, at which point the extent of the social state in the U.S., especially if you include like the semi-public, semi-private aspect of it, was at least on a par with all the rest of Western and Central Europe. But the big difference is that the capitalist classes in Europe came out of the war weakened by war and discredited by their association with fascism. The capitalist class in U.S. came out of the war bigger, stronger than ever, and rehabilitated, right? From the measures of public scorn that they'd drawn because of the Depression. So anyway, this kind of impels a general attack on the left. References to class and to political economy get pretty much expunged out of American political discourse. And at the same time, the growth of psychology as an academic discipline and the money that it had been able to get created a lot of status envy among academics. And once the psychologists, to put it kind of a bit of an oversimplification, but not much, once the psychologists get hold of racial inequality and injustice, it becomes like an individual phenomenon, a pathology, prejudice. So racial inequality increasingly over the 50s and 60s and beyond gets tied to psychological abstractions like prejudice and bigotry, and then ironically under the sway of Black power, inadequate self-esteem for the victims of racism and so forth and so on. And gradually and successfully, the idea of racial injustice gets separated from the class dynamics of American capitalism. Then to put the cherry on top, right, after the Voting Rights Act in 1965, we see over the next 20, 30 years, the emergence of a Black political class that's fully incorporated into the governing structures of the society. And for them, right, race is just as important as a way to deflect the possibility that non-elite Black people could experience bases for solidarity with comparably situated non-elite, non-Black people And there's an increasing pressure for insisting on a racial frame of reference as the only proper one for discussing any sorts of apparent inequality that exists among any Black people. And that's the context in which disparity discourse, right, has become like a club that works. So at this point, it's ironic that and I think the question was kind of leading me in this direction too, but that there's a sense in which anti-racism as a politics today does exactly for the PO or the Black and POC professional and managerial strata, right, does the same sort of work that race does for the right and did for the segregationists and the white supremacists, as a deflection away from the material inequalities that exist even within the Black American population.
You mean race and racism does for the right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. So
yeah.
So anti-racism functions in a similar manner to what racism functioned.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. But for the woke left and the old-fashioned right. Yeah.
Okay, so we should try and wrap up here. We still haven't touched on the subtitle of the talk or the conversation, "What is to be done?" And
okay. Yeah.
I mean, you've sort of hinted at it, in terms of fighting for a social democratic universalism. And I guess I would ask, how we hope to revive that kind of a politics, given that things seem to be going in the direction that things are going. And, the U.S. just elected its first female president, who also happens to be Black, right? Because Biden is going to be dead.
Vice president. Yeah.
No. Because Biden's not sticking around.
Yeah. No, you're right.
Yeah. And even if he's around, he's not functioning.
Right.
So let's just be honest about who's
right.
actually there.
Yeah.
And the liberal elites are gonna, just as they did during the Obama era, they're going to make this, that this is a sign of progress, and this is what
right.
America is. It's about racial progress, and we have to keep working at it, etc.
Right.
And as a way to make sure that that social democracy, whether in the form of something like a Sanders insurgency or something else, doesn't make a comeback. But how do you see things moving forward?
Well, that's when the real despair comes, Umair. Because, I mean, like this is almost at the level of existential crisis because it's, in the first place, it's so obvious what the game is, right? I mean, thinking back to the 2020 Democratic primaries, right? I mean, most of us never thought that Bernie was going to be elected president, or that the Democratic elites would permit him to get the nomination, right? But what we did think was possible and hoped was possible was that as Sanders's message got out beyond the chattering classes, right, and that got out, to working people, we would have organizing opportunities. And I think that was correct, right? I mean, you remember that in at least, I think, 20 consecutive primaries, no matter what happened with Bernie, poll data, right? I mean, exit poll data, that's the word I was looking for, showed that Medicare for All was the big winner in the Democratic primaries. Like people, and even in South Carolina, where I worked, where Biden sort of cleaned Bernie's clock in the voting, even there, more than a majority of the Democratic voters said that they favored Medicare for All. And I mean, that was true without regard to race, right? And that's the kind of thing that you can work with, right? Because what we found in our work, in popular communities is the way to put it, I guess. Around Medicare for All is that once people start talking among themselves about, that, or about the idea of healthcare being available to all as a right without regard to ability to pay, then they naturally start to talk on their own, right? Without the goosing of the skilled organizer or an ideologue. They start to talk on their own about access to higher education being available as a right, housing, right, et cetera. And COVID was unfortunate, obviously, because it came at the time that it came, and I'm not in any way suggesting a conspiracy about this, except in this sense, that the other side, it knows how to take advantage of opportunities that present themselves. And it's not that they're so much smarter than we are, although I think they have the advantage over much of what calls itself a left, because they've got a clear vision that they want to maintain and to realize, where our side is all over the damn place, right? But of course they also have the capacity to move, and the combination of COVID that sort of understandably knocked us all for a loop, but the George Floyd murder and the Breonna Taylor murder also provided them an opportunity to change the conversation, right? And to shift. So all of a sudden, the fact that at least 14 million, and I know that this number has to be on the low side, people have lost health insurance during the pandemic. 27 million people have been unemployed, I believe. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about those numbers either. But they're big, and they're only going to be bigger, which is the most important thing for us to know about them. All of a sudden, and of course, Blacks and Hispanics are disproportionately among the ranks of those who are most adversely affected. But all of a sudden, even Uber and Walmart and Amazon and Goldman Sachs, right? The most, I'm trying not to be profane here, but some of the worst corporations in the world with respect to labor rights, et cetera, are like coughing up close to $2 billion in Black Lives Matter money. And this question of where the $2 billion is going, and who's getting it, and what's the point? But in this moment, right? With that on the one side, and the ritualistic demands for symbolic expressions, right, coming from the heart of the Wall Street elite now, right? Schumer, Pelosi, Biden, the rest of them, like kneeling like it's a Black American frat step show, with the kente cloth, going through the ritualistic pieties. This I'm afraid is what we're going to get, right? And that's like a rerun of Obama, and that's all that Biden kept saying right throughout the campaign. The two things that he told us were, I'm going to go back to the good old days of Obama, and I can work with my opposition, right? So, like, I had joked that what we're going to have is like a government of national salvation, right, or a national salvation council, like what often gets installed after the military takes power someplace, right? But short of that, my greatest concern is that 4 years of this kind of waffling and fundamentally arrogant muddling through, right? Like, it's arrogant in the sense that they just think they can write off, like the working population of America. That's going to set the stage for a more competent version of Trump, right? And that's that's my greatest fear. And I just don't see, like at this point, I don't see reassuring signs that our side is going to be able to overcome it, right? Because I think, see, and here's another thing that, and I guess I'll stop after this one. That I mean, everybody in the U.S. it is just preternaturally given to understand that that a Black social justice agenda is equivalent to, tantamount to, or part of a left agenda of social transformation, right? And I think that that's ultimately because of the point that I made a while ago about the period when the racial democratic and the social democratic tendencies in Black American politics sort of rode together, were very tightly parallel or converged. Although, I mean, even then, in specific instances, and this is something else that's so good about Preston Smith's work, that he examines this, like the class contradictions within Black politics bubbled onto the surface, and people thought about stuff right around housing, when issues, for one thing. And I think that's sociologically speaking, right? Because we all have imbibed this understanding with our mother's milk, basically. It's really hard for people to break with that premise, right? With that presumption. And in a way, the older they are, the harder it is, right? Because I came into the movement in the mid to late 1960s, and came from a left family, and it was just understood, right, that anti-racist politics. Because Lord, like in my cohort, like we were part of the cohort that gave the world third worldism, right? So it's all there, right? But the dwindling number of people from the generation up prior to me were even more convinced, right? Because the fact was, the only people in the society who really stood up for Black rights were the left, right? Well, so now what we've got is popular cultural, and in the category of popular culture, I would include most of the sort of woke historiography, right, of the last 15 to 20 years, which kind of flattens out all of the class politics in the Black American history. What you've got is a picture that's the version of the common sense that people my age came up with, but with all of the edges beveled off. And it's almost like the Disneyfied version of the understanding that black is left, left is Black. And that's how you get into this preposterous, these preposterous constructs like non-POCs having to be allies and not full participants in a movement. I mean, my God. But anyway, so one of the main challenges for us is to stave off where we think, or what I think is most likely to be the outcome of 4 or even 8 years of Harris-Biden, Biden-Harris rule, is to try to break the thrall of this notion that, like, any random Black person that comes up to you and demands that you do something is somebody you should listen to. And it's just hard. I mean, I don't know if we can do it. I hope we can, because otherwise, and the final thing on this, right? I just want to say this now, since I'm tossing the firecrackers around, that, there's a standard account of how Trump was a reaction to Obama that I'm sure everybody knows. But I want to suggest a slightly different account of how Obama was the gateway drug to Trump. And it goes like this. Obama ran in 2008 and offered us himself as embodiment of a new kind of progressivism that wasn't tied to any kind of policy agenda, but was just bound up with a call to identify with his persona and the narrative of who he was and what he'd overcome and what, and that was the transcendence that was going to make people's lives better coming out of the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009. And we know what he did and what he didn't do, right? So then when Trump runs, and I mean, I've read some pretty good stuff on this. In fact, we published a couple of articles on this issue in nonsite.org, one by Leslie Lopez and one by Christian Peretti that I would urge people to read. That from the working class voters, in one instance, Hispanic working class voters with a trade union history, who said basically that I believed Trump just like I believed Obama, or that I voted for Obama and, because of what he promised, and now I'm voting for Trump because of what he's promising. And when you get down to it, what Obama promised was not just his persona, but the racial narrative that his persona what was embedded in. That was the thing that was going to deliver us, and that's what Trump said too. Ultimately, right? It's like the racial character of the narrative that his persona was embedded in, and it comes back to this. I mean, obviously, it's much too early to say anything about this with respect to 2020. But what we do know is that in 2016, between more than 6.5 million and over 9 million people who voted for Trump were people who had voted for Sanders in the primaries in 2016 and had voted for Obama at least once. So there's something more than American workers are so racist. What's going on there? And if we persist with that, which of course is the line that the MSNBC types want to run, and want us to run, but if we persist in seeing racism versus anti-racism, or sexism versus anti-sexism as the principal fault lines in American society, we're going to lose, and we're going to lose, not just the presidential election, but I mean democracy. Like I joked early on that that after a second Trump term, he'd be followed by Bolsonaro. But the problem with that is, I'm just too close to Brazil. But Bolsonaro is the same kind of clown that Trump is, and the danger is that he'd be followed by someone like Sergio Moro or Orban or Modi, right? All right, I'm done. Sorry.
Okay, so a lot of challenges to overcome.
Yes. Right.
All right. So on that note, I guess we should turn to the question and answer period, which I think we have about a half hour for.
Great.
Or
Okay.
a bit less than that. But so I'm going to ask Ange if she could tell us what some of the questions are. Maybe one at a time. I don't know how we should do this, but
Yeah, we can just do one at a time. And I just want to remind people that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen that they can use. So the first question is from Simon. And Simon asks, do you believe there's any productive method of using race as a unit of analysis without reinforcing the fallacious idea of racial traits? And if not, how do you think the current focus on race as a metric can be undone?
Okay. Wow. That's a very good and challenging and tough question. Well, I used to say that in principle, racism is the idea that races exist, right? Where most people would think that, well, you sort of take race, as Umair said, kind of in stride, and just see the difference between race and would see racism as the worked up ideology that, you know, some races are good and some races are bad. But as things have gone on, right, in the direction, and we've been sliding in the direction that we've been sliding, I've been more inclined to say, well, when you think the word race or see the word race written, pause for a second and substitute either Sasquatch or unicorn. And if Sasquatch could work as a unit of analysis, then okay, then I guess race could work as a unit of analysis. I mean, and yeah, that's a little facetious, but really not entirely, right? I mean, because the question is how race is used as a unit of analysis. I mean, race can and has functioned as a shorthand for causal accounts of things in the world, right? I mean, obviously, and it certainly does now. But that's what race always was, frankly, right? I mean, race has always been a shorthand, a shorthand characterization and explanation of positions within an established system of hierarchy, right? And when you say, and see, this is one of the problems with the police killing thing, right? Because I mean, this is how it can be true that both police say, you know, I'm afraid for my life, and they shoot like an unarmed person 28 times, right? Because the racial classification or the racial appearance or whatever is there as a shorthand that tells the police officer that this is a person to be wary of and to be treated as a dangerous sort. And I mean, you know, you don't see as many of these now. I think Botan Jean, I may be getting his name wrong, the guy in Dallas who was shot by the female cop that lived on the floor underneath him, is one of the more recent ones. But especially in the 90s, there was a big spate of what I think of as a sort of Charles Chestnut novel character, right? Like the really respectable Black person who gets stopped and jacked up and beaten down by the police. And part of the complaint is that this is a person who is in no way a criminal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that also shows you what one of the problems is with using race as a shorthand for other features. So, I mean, that's, so I'd be very wary. Well, obviously it always, I mean, depends on what the research question is, but I'd be very wary about using the shorthand, especially at this point, because people are less inclined to see the shorthand as a shorthand than they were when I was 25 years old. And that's not supposed to be the the way the world is going, right? I mean, around the time that Charles Murray published the bell curve in the mid 90s, I had a friend who's an intellectual historian of the U.S. say to me, "Yeah, but you know, the 20th century wasn't so much fun that we need to relive it from beginning to end, like all over again." So I mean, that's the one thing. And like the other thing I would say about it is that it's important to keep in mind, it's really important to keep in mind that race cannot be the subject of a sentence that has anything to do with causality or subjectivity even. Because racists don't do anything, they don't make anything happen, they don't think anything. And frankly, I mean, racism doesn't either, right? Like racism is at best a shorthand way, or that provides an alternative to an explanation of multiple different layers and dynamics that produce and reproduce quite specific inequalities in different domains in society. So I don't know if that means no, there is no way to salvage it, but my inclination is it probably does mean no, but that just means that I haven't thought of all the possible ways that race can be a unit of analysis. But Rogers Brubaker, though, is very sharp on this point, which is that it's important for us not to conflate categories of analysis with objects of analysis, right? And race is clearly an object of analysis, but it does not function well as a category for analysis, or rather of analysis.
Right.
So I hope that's helpful.
So not to confuse the abstract with something concrete.
Right, exactly. Thank you.
Okay, so I imagine we have other questions. So Ange, let us know.
Yep. The next question is from Russell, and Russell asks, in a recent article, you argue that a focus on the effort to eliminate racial disparities will not only take us in the direction of a more equal society, it isn't even the best way of eliminating racial disparities themselves. Can you explain?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, well, yeah, I'll give an illustration about the latter point, right? That take disparately high rates of Black unemployment in the U.S., for instance. And I apologize to being so parochial about this. So we've put a fair amount of effort, not anywhere near enough, into policies and programs like affirmative action that have focused on trying to reduce the racial gap in unemployment. The problem, though, and this can be, and we can extrapolate this problem from employment that health conditions and whatnot. The problem is that if to the extent that the overall logic of 21st century American capitalism accelerates unemployment, right? Within the economy as a whole, the racially specific remedy is unlikely to be able to catch up with the extent to which capitalist labor market dynamics are increased unemployment and underemployment. And from that perspective, I mean, this has also been clear, or had been clear to multiple cohorts of Black activists and advocates. Tight labor markets do more for reducing the employment gap as well as the income gap than direct interventions. It's the same thing with respect to public health stuff, right? There's a shitload of money and careers and all kinds of opportunities now available, especially because of COVID, for healthcare practitioners, and that's great. Like, we need many of them, and many more of them, at least in the U.S. But I'm sure you guys could use some more too. But to the extent that the sources of Black health disparities have less to do with health practices and health conditions than with overall function within the economy. For instance, greater likelihood to live in crowded substandard housing, greater likelihood to experience employment and income insecurity and so forth and so on. That direct attacks on worse health outcomes for Black people are less likely to be successful in closing the health outcomes gap than interventions that tighten up labor markets, that improve healthcare access for everybody, and so forth and so on. So, I mean, does that get at it? Question, Russell, I think.
I think so.
Okay.
Okay. So let's see. Do we have other questions?
Yeah, there's a bunch more questions.
Okay.
Yolanda has a question. How do we move to a level of understanding of race and inequality within the Black community?
Well, that's also a good question. I would start by saying, Upton Sinclair, the writer and left populist politician, like in California, once said famously, and I'm going to botch the quote, but take the spirit of it, that it's very difficult to get a man to believe something if his living depends on him not believing it. And we got to understand that class dynamics operate among Black people like they operate among everybody else. So but it's just an illustration. Like when I worked in both Sanders campaigns, and both times, as one of the lines coming against Sanders from the Black PMC and the woke left was that Sanders didn't offer anything to Black people. And I got that question a lot on the campaign trail. And whenever I got it, I responded the same way, which was to walk down the program item by item and ask whether or not this was a policy proposal that would have disproportionately beneficial impact on Blacks and Hispanics. And in every case, and I swear, I mean, this isn't, I'm certain that this is not just a selective recollection of memory, but I never had that conversation with a single Black working person who, at the conclusion of my spiel, didn't say, yeah, I see your point. And or I'm sorry, maybe, or I mean, perhaps not. Within our class, however, that response hardly registered, right? Because the point is that you've got two different understandings out there, at least, of what the interests of the Black community are, or who the Black community is, right? I mean, you remember when Marissa Johnson and her buddy disrupted a Sanders rally in Seattle in 2016 or 2015. And it was a rally about defense of the Social Security program, which, for those not familiar with the U.S., is the old age pension benefit program. And Johnson, who had been like a Sarah Palin supporter in 2008, as a kid, but still, what she and her friend contended was that Social Security didn't have anything to do with Black people, when, of course, Black people are less likely, for historic reasons, to have private pensions than whites are, for class reasons, not so much for racial reasons. So to that extent, one could argue that Social Security is more of a Black issue than it is a non-Black issue. But see, the problem is that what makes sense for you to think of as the primary concerns of Black Americans and of something called the Black community, which I tend not to talk about anymore because I think it's also an unhelpful reification, just as is the idea of a Black freedom movement or a Black liberation struggle or whatever. Because the notion of Black community and those other notions about the movement rest on an understanding of who the Black American population is, that is monolithic and it doesn't have any space for class differences in it, right? And so, from that perspective, I'm not really trying to win anything in the Black community. I think that notion, just like the notion of a Black agenda, is now just about the exclusive property of the professional and the managerial strata and above, who whose concern is with propounding like an understanding of what Black people want and the need that privileges their own narrow interest. And I don't mean they're bad people or they're venal, but because that's just the way that ideology works. I mean, what you see is a function of where you stand. And if you don't have to be concerned about unemployment, well, the unemployment just doesn't seem like a Black issue, but in your understanding of the Black community. So,
or if you think that your chances of gaining employment are helped by you posing this idea of this abstract Black community, then of course, then you won't let it go.
right, exactly, absolutely, yeah, and absolutely.
And I think you would say that probably most most Black people probably are already at a place of understanding about race and racism, that they understand that their differences or their interests are not necessarily distinct from the majority of the so-called white population or anyone else. It's
I think that's right.
It's the activists who seek to represent the interests of the Black community who would suggest otherwise.
Right, and it's telling in that sense, on that very point, right, that the insistence on a race-first politics has become louder, more shrill, more complete, more irrational, more inclined, right, to read white supremacy back to the Olduvai Gorge, basically, as the empirical realities of both Black economic integration into the society as a whole, and of increasing economic differentiation among Black people have grown. And it makes sense, right? It's like, I mean, how do you resolve cognitive dissonance in a way, right? It's like, well, we have this ideology that comes up against the material realities. Well, cover your ears and just scream louder, right? And you got to do it because the class politics depends on you being able to ventriloquize a mute mass.
Right. Okay. So, Ange, how are we doing for time? Do we have time for a couple more questions?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, the next one is from Noah, and Noah says, "Thank you for a fascinating analysis. Can you please explain how you reconcile the disproportionate police stops, use of force, and killings of Black and other racialized people, even outside low-income zip codes? In Canada, and I believe in the US, this is well documented. Likewise, differential treatment in the criminal justice and correctional systems. Example, how you reconcile it with what I think is your conclusion that race is not a factor. Though I understand and agree that it is not the only factor."
Right. No. Like I never said. Race is not a factor. Right. I mean, I had my own experiences. Like I've often said, when I was like probably 19 and saw the Battle of Algiers in a theater, I thought, wow, I know this movie. I've been in this movie. Right. I mean, so I'm not saying that I've never said that, but.
You should probably. I don't know if everyone gets the Battle of Algiers.
Oh,
reference.
sorry. Yeah, it's a film. Well, yeah, it's a film about the Algerian War and the insurgency against French.
French occupation.
In the city of Algiers, 1954. But and my son had it, right. He was arrested on the way home from high school by a Black cop, interestingly, with a jerry curl, but that's neither here nor there. And then a Black major at the New Haven, police department got sent out to cool out the community and explain the good police practices to us. So I'm not naive about any of that stuff. But see, even a construct like race as a factor, that doesn't tell us anything, right? I mean, what can tell us something is what I said a while ago, that race is a problematic shorthand that police, but others use also to make snap distinctions about people for whom they need to show some kind of regard and people for whom they don't, right? So as long as there is a distribution of goods and bads in American society for the foreseeable future, because of a history of racial injustice that has limited access to the mechanisms of social mobility to blacks and other non-whites, and also because of the persistence of this kind of shorthand that we understand as prejudice, it's likely that in any queue of like distribution, blacks and other non-whites are going to be disproportionately represented at the bottom. But that's not newsworthy, right? I mean, who would be surprised by that, right? Would anybody really be surprised if that's the case? So the question is how to combat it. And my argument is that the only effective way to combat it is to alter the distribution queue, right? And that's, again, what people like, A. Philip Randolph and even Martin Luther King later what understood about the struggle for justice for Black Americans, like in the U.S., right? The only way for us to move forward is by tackling the inequalities that are produced by capitalism, and not just the inequalities that are produced within capitalism. And frankly, as I've said, in both in practical terms, but also like in ideological terms, I don't think that we can effectively attack those inequalities that are produced within capitalism unless we tie that to the bigger struggle to attack inequalities that are produced by capitalism.
Right. So your son, even though he was the son of a professor, because his father and he himself were black, was more likely to be stopped by the police than a son of a white professor.
Right.
You have no problem acknowledging that, but you would say that the disproportionate targeting of whether they're rich or poor Black people, that's not the issue. It's not that more sons of white professors should be stopped by the police.
Right, exactly. And I'll also say that my son had much less of a chance of being stopped and jacked up by the police than his classmates in high school who lived in the housing projects 6 blocks over.
Whether white or black, probably.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so do we have? I don't know. It's 5:28. What's? Should we do another question?
I mean, I'm good. I can stay as long as you want. So.
Okay.
Okay, so another question is from an attendee who asks if you could expand on your thoughts on non-POC allyship. They'd be interested to hear more about your perspective.
Oh,
on this.
yeah. I mean, easy. I hate the idea, right? In fact, I most often refer to them not as allies, but as vampires. What's the word? The human person who goes and catches the flies for him, and closes the coffin. We're either in a movement together or there is no movement, right? And this notion, and look, I mean, I think the POC population in Canada is a smaller percentage of the overall population than in the US. But even if it's greater, the same problem holds. It's on one level, it's a simple numbers game, right? Like in a nominally, I mean, democratic society, you've got to approach the project of political change from the standpoint of building persuasive majorities. And I don't mean, necessarily like a majority coalition to win an election, but the whole purpose of political transformation toward a better world is the project of uniting the many to defeat the few, as Mao Zedong once put it. I'm not endorsing Mao, but it kind of works. So the notion of an ally is frankly demeaning. And you know what? If I were concerned of being part of a struggle, and somebody told me, okay, well, you can't do anything, you can't say anything, you have to wait for me to tell you what to do because you're an ally, you know, I'd say, well, I would say something I can't say here, I believe, but I would say that you should go do something to yourself, and I'm going home because I'm not going to be a part of this, right? I mean, so no, I don't. What I find the idea of white or any other kind of allyship as fundamentally morally, politically, and existentially a repugnant notion. So I guess that's clear enough, isn't it?
Right. And I think it's interesting that when we do adopt a racialist politics, we give the majority over to the right. We say, well, the white people are the majority. They're not part of us. You can have them. And so they have a majoritarian coalition already.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, so it really does like do a bit of the devil's work, right? It's not enough to make you want to look for paychecks, but Lord, I mean, because the sad thing is you don't really need to pay them at this point.
Yeah. Okay. Do we have time for more?
No, I think we're done. I think it's time for Jim to pop up.
Oh, okay.
I just want to thank both of you for a very energetic and thoughtful discussion and conversation. We appreciate it greatly. I want to tell the audience that the Center for Free Expression has weekly events. The one next week will be on a panel looking at smart cities in Canada, titled Digital Dreams and Corporate Designs. And we'll bring together a panel of experts dealing with some of the complicated questions behind the apparent attractiveness of smart city initiatives that are spreading across the country. Following that, the following week, we're going to have a panel that we're doing jointly with London South Bank University. It's going to be on December 9th, entitled Cancel Culture, Censorship, and Free Expression. And our first event in the new year in January will be on anti-Black racism and language. So for a full list of our events, please go to the Center for Free Expression website, cfe.ryerson.ca. There's video recordings of all our events that we've had in the past, and today's will be posted tomorrow. Will be available on that website. Thank you again so much for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks.